You mean to tell me he left everything to her? The question hit the room and kept going. It did not land on me so much as it circled, searching for a target. It found my name instead. Billionaire boss dies, leaves fortune to black adopted daughter, and the family freaks out. That is the headline they printed the next day. That is the headline that kept me awake. Justice is messy and slow, but it is real when someone you trusted plans it and follows through. Strength is not loud. Strength is stubborn and patient. Where are you watching this from right now? What's the weather where you are? Tell me in the comments, and if this is the kind of story you stay up for, hit like and subscribe. I need you paying attention because what comes next is not a revenge fantasy. It is what happens when someone decides to pay attention to the small, honest things while everyone else chases noise. My name is Amara Harlow. This is the story of how I went from the woman they treated as an extra pair of hands to the person who held the envelope with my name and the keys to a $600 million estate. I remember the moment the lawyer said my name. I remember my fingers closing around a sealed envelope he set on the table in front of me. I remember the silence after the words and what everyone in that silence did next. But let me start from the beginning. I was 26 when Richard Harlow died. I had been with him in some form since I was 10. He did not walk in and adopt me that day like a scene from a film. He signed papers, he argued with men in suits, he told me to stop crying, and then he showed up, and he stayed. He taught me to use the old typewriter in his study. He taught me how to tie a tie when I wanted to feel taller at family dinners, and he called me his daughter with a steadiness I had never had before. I believed then that family was what you protected, even if protection meant you kept your mouth shut. I also believed that loyalty was currency. That belief is a dangerous thing in the wrong house. I learned to trade it away in small pieces. I would run his errands and sit at receptions while the real heirs made lists and calculated taxes. I thought my devotion was visible. I thought that if I kept showing up and stayed useful, it would be payment enough. They called me helpful names behind closed doors. They put my plate near the sink at gatherings. I let them. I wanted to belong more than I wanted to be seen, and the wanting made me soft in all the ways they knew how to exploit. There was a detail then that meant nothing to me. Richard kept an old brass key in the pocket of an overcoat he never wore when he visited that house. He once slipped it into my hand because I had been the one who reached for his coat when he left. I laughed and tucked it in my purse without thinking. Later that day I forgot it was there. Small things in that house were easy to overlook. That key sat in my bag while they plotted and while the banker passed me papers to sign I did not read. At the reading, the room smelled of polished surfaces and nervous cologne, but I will not spend time describing rooms. What matters is the sequence. The lawyer unfolded sheets, read the dry legal language, and then he said, "Amara Harlow, sole beneficiary." Someone said the question I started with. A woman I had grown up around, who had once taught me how to fold napkins, said, "Are you serious?" My cousin, Quentin, laughed and said something that had contempt in it and no patience for surprises. I had no script for this. I had only a life of small favors and quiet devotion. When he said my name, my hands did not know what to do. I reached for the sealed envelope the lawyer put in front of me and felt the shuffle of bodies. There were faces around me that had smiled politely for 30 years and faces now that showed teeth. I slid the envelope into my coat pocket and kept my hands where they would not be a target. That envelope is the first invisible thing I held in the new life. It was only paper, but it was also his handwriting and his instruction. I did not open it then. I did not know I would need to keep it closed as insurance. I did not know his voice still had plans. They freaked out. They hissed about trashing the will. They spoke about lawyers and affidavits, as if language could erase memory. My sister figure, Ivy Harlow, who had once offered me a smile when no one else would, now called me a fraud and said nothing to my face. Voices split into private corners and lists were read off phones. Quentin moved closer and said, "You don't understand corporate governance. You are not ready." He said it as if readiness were a thing you could summon from one afternoon of anger. The ticking clock began then. The board meeting was scheduled for 2 days. The company had an interim review, and the family planned to use it to force me into decisions before I understood what they were. They planned to flood the room with allies who would talk me into signing documents that would make my name meaningless. They planned to convince the world I was a convenient mistake. I had 48 hours to learn who would help me and who would do everything to erase me. The lawyer told me, as if offering practicality, that probate could be contested and that challenges often began within a week. A contest would cost time, money, and proof. They expected me to be quiet and small and to accept that the world preferred a simpler narrative. There is something else I should tell you now, because it matters for what comes next and because it is one of the reasons I survived what followed. At the time, I did not know that some of them had already hired a private investigator. I would learn that later. I only knew my name had been read aloud and that people I had trusted were already moving against me. I had been included in their family for convenience, and I had not known the depth of that convenience. My flaw was simple. I valued belonging more than I protected myself. That made me vulnerable in ways that showed up in small choices. I smiled when they turned away. I apologized when they cut me off. I paid for dinners when I could not afford them because Richard once told me generosity made people comfortable. I thought kindness was proof enough that I belonged. That error would teach me everything I needed to change. Before the reading ended, Quentin stood up and made a show of it. He said, "We will not let this happen without a fight." He made sure a camera caught his fury. Ivy murmured that there were other documents and that this would be ugly. They promised to make me move out of the house, to challenge the trust, and to expose me if necessary. Exposure, they said, as if my life had been one long construction of lies. A cousin I had watered plants for at holiday dinners promised to ruin my reputation. I went home that night to a small room I had kept for myself in Richard's house. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened the sealed envelope. I should not have. The rules I will follow in this story require that I do not reveal what is in that envelope yet. The law of this narrative, the thing that kept every reader glued to the next episode, is that I learned something that gave me a way forward. For now, all I will say is that the envelope contained a single sentence and a set of directions that made me understand one thing clearly. He had watched who stayed and who left. I slept poorly and I woke with a decision forming. I told myself that I would not run. I would not be the soft target they could laugh about in future interviews. I would learn where they had been dishonest, and I would hold them to it. At the reading, the family had split. Men in expensive suits had already begun posting edited clips online. The next morning, the tabloids would arrive. The board meeting would be the test. Quentin had already begun to whisper about immediate changes. They expected I would break. They did not know one detail then. The brass key in my bag from his coat was not as innocent as I had thought. It fit a lock I did not yet know I needed to open. That is the kind of small thing he left me on purpose. I could not see then that he had trained me in small habits, because the big habits were theirs. I will end this act here, because the rest requires pulling on the thread that was set when they called me a fraud and when Quentin promised a fight. There are 3 things you need to hold the way I did: the sealed envelope, the brass key in my pocket, and the board meeting in 48 hours. Those 3 things are a clock, a tool, and a promise. The family had already started stabbing at each other, and they had no idea what would come for them next. If you are still with me, if you feel that tight curiosity that keeps people listening, leave a comment with where you are watching from and what the weather is. Tell me you are ready for the next part. I promise the next act will start with a choice I made that changed everything, and it will end with a question I could not answer at the moment. I thought the hardest part ended when the lawyer read my name aloud. I was wrong. The second morning after the reading started with a phone that wouldn't stop. The first call was from Layla, Richard's assistant, who knew the company's calendar and the man's habits better than anyone. She did not ask how I was. She told me where to be and what to expect. Listen, she said. You need two things before the board meets. 1. A sense of what the books actually look like. 2. People who know the difference between grief and leverage. She said it without softness. I took it as kindness. I needed both. Layla brought me into the building that had always felt like a place Richard moved in, not a place I belonged in. She gave me a stack of folders short enough that I could carry them and heavy enough that I wouldn't forget the weight of responsibility. She showed me names, executive team, long-tenured managers, division heads who owed their careers to him. She pointed at a page and said, "Those are the people the family has quietly cultivated. They will be the first line. Who will be the second line?" I asked, because the family had already demonstrated they would not hesitate to pull a second, third, and fourth against me. She looked at me without paper between us and said, "Quentin and Ivy will place their bets publicly. The rest will follow where money tells them to follow." Quentin had announced a public fight at the reading. Ivy had chosen contempt. Layla's bluntness made me feel less alone, and that relief loosened something in my chest I did not yet name. I wanted to hold on to that relief, so I made a choice to trust Layla more than I trusted the people born into the family. Layla had her own reasons to help. She had loyalty to Richard that showed in details, a small way she tapped a calendar, a note tucked behind a folder with the word remedies on top. She said, "He left breadcrumbs," as if breadcrumbs were predictable things. My hands closed around a folder called Legal Custody, and I tried to read the shorthand the lawyers used without letting my eyes swim. While Layla gave me facts, the family gave me gestures. Ivy arranged lunch at the house. It felt like an offer. I wanted an ally. I wanted someone who remembered folding my napkins. I wanted to believe the woman who had once offered a smile over dessert could be more than a performance. We sat at the long table, and Ivy handled her fork like a practiced diplomat. Her voice was low when she spoke to me, the way she always spoke when she wanted people to think she was private. "You can't run this overnight," Ivy said. "Let us help you manage the transition. Let Quentin and I take care of operations. You can lead the foundation side. You can be the face of what Dad wanted us to do." "Why me on the foundation?" I asked. "Why not the company?" I was named as a beneficiary. "Because you need space," she said. "Because controlling a company in a storm doesn't help anyone. Let the board appoint an interim team. Let us give you time to grieve." There was mercy in her words. There was an easy logic. There was also, as I would learn in pieces, a tactic. I said yes. I have said yes to things my whole life because yes kept the room from closing around me. Yes kept me at the table. Yes felt like belonging. Saying yes now was a bright, naive echo of the 10-year-old who had clung to Richard's coat. After lunch, Ivy handed me a document titled Transitional Management Agreement. She said it was a formality. "Sign this so our council can show vendors and partners that there's a plan," she said. "It just keeps things steady." Layla watched quietly from the doorway. Gideon, the lawyer who had read the will, sat with his hands folded like a man who had rehearsed solace. Ivy explained each paragraph as if she were walking me through a recipe. She pointed at a clause that read, in plain, legal language, about temporary delegation of managerial authorities, and another clause about emergency powers to ensure business continuity. She called those phrases procedural. I did not read the appendix. I hadn't read the will when it was read. I had learned to trust words spoken by people who had been kind when I was small. I signed where she indicated. The first betrayal will always feel like a bruise you had no language for until afterward. The bruise this time was not an insult shouted in a hallway. It was ink on paper that moved power from my hands into a room where they had already counted the votes. Quentin's phone vibrated twice during the signing. I watched him answer with a smile that cut clean. He said, "Perfect. Move the vote forward." He did not try to hide the satisfaction. He said it into the phone the way someone orders for delivery. We sat with the papers. Ivy patted my hand and said, "You did the right thing." My palm felt colder than I expected. That afternoon, the board called an emergency session. Gideon said it was within their rights to convene. He said it in neutral tones. Neutrality means the absence of rebellion. Gideon had always been a steady voice in rooms where men said things and expected them to be thought of as decisions. At 3:02 p.m., my phone buzzed with a packed inbox, messages from investors, murmured headlines, a message from an old family friend asking if I was up to the pressure. One journalist sent a blunt text. Sources say the board will name an interim CEO. Is that true? I had no answer because the document I had signed gave the board the opening they needed. Before the vote, someone leaked a photo with a caption designed to be a question. Is the heiress ready? The photo was cropped to freeze me laughing in a private moment. It made me look young and out of place. Quentin liked the taste of the reaction. Ivy called it a controlled narrative. I began to see how language could be used not to describe but to arrange. Layla came to me between meetings with a face that said she had stayed up all night reading. She handed me a list of people, managers, legal counsel, trustees, names I had to remember. She said, there are 2 things to watch. 1, who votes? 2, who shows up in print? Who voted with them? I asked, hands numb. Layla named people I had seen at events, at the gala my first year, at the charity brunch where I had spilled wine and laughed it off. They were the kind of people who build quiet allegiances for favors owed. They would vote with their ledger balanced. My presence at a table did not mean they would consider me family. It meant they would calculate which side held their balance. At the board meeting, Quentin spoke first. He framed it like a rescue. He used lines about stewardship and protecting legacy. He said the company needed stabilized leadership because markets are unforgiving. He did not talk about the will. He did not say my name in the phrase he used about family continuity. He stared at me the way someone counts gains. Iva, the head of investor relations, a woman I recognized from every quarterly, rose and read a short statement of support for the motion Quentin had drafted. The vote moved fast. The meeting room closed like a valve. People I had smiled at for years gave spectral nods and put their hand up. I had expected resistance. I had not expected collaboration and silent obedience. I had not expected Gideon, who had read the will and watched the letters form my name aloud, to say, the board has the responsibility to act in the company's best interest, as if his mouth had been greased for that particular phrase. When the vote passed, they clapped in small pockets. Quentin looked as if he had been holding his breath. Later that evening, Ivy stopped by my small room at the house. Her shoes made no sound, and she kept the easy face of someone checking on a consolation prize. You did what he would have wanted, she said. You showed mercy. I could have been angry. I could have thrown the document on the floor and let the paper bruise under the weight of words. But the truth is, the easiest thing is often to keep the room from closing. I had once been 10 and grateful for being invited to the table. Now the table was a stage, and every chair had a map of where to sit. I felt foolish that I had not read the map. That night I found another message on my phone. It was a photograph of a man in a car across from the building where our company kept its archive. The caption read, "We have questions. We can find things." The sender was unknown. Somewhere, someone was writing a dossier. The first betrayal was not a scream. It was a form I signed because I was trying not to be difficult. It was a vote that cut the rope of power they pretended I had. It was Ivy's hands in patience, Gideon's hands in neutrality, Quentin's hands in a quick calculation. It was the way of family that smiled for pictures could arrange to make you feel like a footnote. A part of me wanted to run back to Richard's study, open his drawers where old keys hid, and look for some proof that this was not what he intended. Instead, I found the brass key in my bag, warm from my hand. I had almost forgotten about the key. I had almost forgotten he had slipped it to me years ago. It was small, ordinary, and now it felt like a question he had left behind for me to ask later. So I placed the key on the table and I read the signed document again until the sentences blurred into a shape I could not lift. The family had started to shape a narrative around me. Grief equals incapacity. Youth equals inexperience. They had forgotten that a name on a paper can be a beginning as much as an end. I had to learn how to use names in documents like tools, not like wounds. There were 3 things now I could not unsee. First, the board could and would move to control the company under the cover of stability. Second, the family had already cultivated reporters and allies who would weaponize image and rumor. Third, the envelope Richard had given me and the brass key in my bag were not idle props. One was an instruction, the other a lock whose purpose I did not yet understand. I went to sleep that night with the taste of betrayal sharpened into a plan I did not yet have words for. In the morning, Kinternet recirculated an op-ed that had belonged to a cousin's ally. The headline asked if a non-blood heir could carry the Harlow legacy. The comment threads were cruel in efficient ways. My phone buzzed. An unknown number called and hung up. The private investigator Gerald, because Gerald was his name, he had been paid to find dirt, left me a message that said he had seen things and would call back with proof. I listened to the message twice and then deleted it, because the file on my phone felt like glass. I had trusted and I had been claimed for my trust. The first betrayal sat in my palm as indexical proof. I had signed away time and language. They had moved tools, forms, votes, headlines into place like pieces of a well-rehearsed play. The board meeting had been the first sash on the cocoon they intended to weave. Quentin thought he had caught me. He had not yet noticed that my silence was not surrender. He did not know that I had read the will before I had signed anything, only not aloud. He did not know that the envelope had a sentence and a set of instructions. He did not know the brass key matched a lock I had not opened yet. He thought he had the public's attention. He had only the beginning of a narrative. I ended the day with 3 unresolved things stacked against me: the board's motion that had shifted management, the leak machine already constructing a story of incompetence, and the unknown contents behind a lock I could open if I could find the right door. If you think this is frightening, wait. The next move was theirs, but the one after that would be mine. My finger hovered over the signature line that would hand them the company. It was a thin, quiet motion. The paper did not tremble. My hands did. The document Layla set in front of me read like a promise dressed in legal language. Temporary delegation of managerial authority. Emergency powers for continuity. 90 days. All practical, all neutral, all designed to look like prudence. Quentin had given them 24 hours. He had framed the demand as protection. He had called it rescue. The board circulated a letter that morning asking me to sign so the company could show partners it had stable leadership. The bank wanted assurances. Vendors wanted guarantees. Payroll did not care which family member owned the name on the masthead. Payroll only wanted a check on Friday. If I did nothing, the accounts could be frozen. The foundation that paid for school books in neighborhoods Richard had promised to support would halt. Layla, who expected to be at her desk Monday morning answering messages in his voice, would be told there was no work. The household staff would get a month of severance if we were lucky. People who had nothing to do with our family feud would lose paychecks because the family wanted more control. Layla was in the doorway, folded in a jacket that made her look like the practical person she was. She did not beg. She explained. "We can fight this, Amara," she said. "But fighting takes time and expenses. We can save payroll now and fight after." He would have wanted that. Would he have? I thought about Richard's steady patience, the way he measured anger with a watch. He used to say care for people is a choice you make every day. That sentence felt like the hinge here. Gideon had already given me the neutral voice. He said, the board has authority under corporate governance to appoint emergency managers to preserve shareholder value. He said it with his hands folded. Neutrality had the weight of permission. Quentin's men had lined the perimeter. They had not sent soldiers. They sent lawyers and press. There was no direct threat, only the quiet certainty of someone who believed he had calculated the outcome. Do I protect people I love and risk losing power? Or do I hold the will in my pocket and watch other people's lives become bargaining chips while I stand on principle? The question burned slow. I thought of the envelope Richard had given me. I had tucked it into the inside pocket of my coat and forgotten, then remembered. I thought of the brass key he had slipped into my hand years ago and the way his eyes had not asked for anything in return. That pair sat on my lap as if they were tools left for an emergency I had not expected. There is a reason fathers leave keys. There is a reason they fold instructions into an old envelope that looks like nothing at all. I opened the paper. A single sentence, clear and not theatrical, told me this. If they move to freeze the estate, go to the Harlow Trust Vault and retrieve box 419. Bring no lawyer. Bring no one who answers to the family name. The instruction did not say why. It did not ask me to trust anyone. It told me to act. That was the point where there was no longer a way to sit out the fight. The letter forced a decision. Do I sign the form and hand them time, or do I gamble on what a sealed instruction promised? I signed. I signed to protect wages, to keep the charity functioning, to keep Layla in a job she did not have to beg for. I signed because I could see 100 nameless consequences unfold in a way the company could not survive. I signed because there is a kind of cruelty in making the powerless wait for principal while their rent comes due. As soon as my pen left the paper, I felt the cost. The signature was a public record. It would be cited in filings and articles as the moment I consented to the plan. I had not and would not consent to being silenced. I would use the time the signature bought me to get whatever Richard had left in that box. The signature bought me days. The days would be a test. Layla did not look relieved. She looked like someone who had counted the cost and found it balanced in the short run. There was guilt under her practicality. Here is where the family's calculations began compounding. I had signed to save the names I loved from immediate poverty. I had given the heirs a veneer of order. I had handed them a tool. Gerald called while I finished my coffee. His voice had the rasp of someone who had been awake for too many nights. Gerald had left a message 2 days earlier saying he had seen things. He had been working privately for the family. I had thought that made him an enemy. He called now and said, "I can get you in tonight. The trust keeps parts of the archive off limits without a family role. I can get you in as a contractor." It felt like a trap. It may have been. Gerald had been paid by my cousins to find dirt. He had also been the person who had once kept a photograph of Richard and me that no one else had because he liked keeping archives. He had a conscience that balanced somewhere between payday and guilt. "Why?" I asked. "Why help me after they hired you?" He was silent for a beat. Then he said, "Because he trusted you. Because the people I worked for gave me too much to keep. Because I do not want them to get all of it. Trust is not currency for everyone. For some people it is more dangerous than gold." Gerald drove with the kind of focus that can be mistaken for courage. Layla sat beside me and rehearsed voices in her head. She knew who to avoid, how the bank's shift teams moved, where cameras went to sleep for an hour. She knew the code for a maintenance door because she had put together schedules and delivery routes in previous jobs. Those details mattered now. We arrived at the Harlow Trust Vault after midnight. I will not invest the narrative in describing the place. That is not the work this moment demands. The ledger of my actions is what matters. We went in through a maintenance entrance that smelled of old paper and late air. Layla's hand found mine once and squeezed. That was the smallest salvation. Box 419 was smaller than I expected. The brass key fit into a tumbler that had not been turned in decades. It seemed almost theatrical when it clicked. The box rose out of the metal drawer like a truth. Inside were paper files and a small hard drive wrapped in an old handkerchief. There were printouts of transactions, names I had heard at galas, shell companies with addresses that matched a private island investment one of my cousins had mentioned once as gossip. There was a ledger that showed funds diverted from charities to private accounts. There was a list of payments to board members and names that matched those who had voted at the emergency meeting. I read until the letters blurred. The files were clean in a way that made my stomach flip. They were direct. They were not accusations. They were recording of transfers, memos, receipts. Whoever had kept these had been careful. Whoever had been paid did not have an alibi that covered numbers and destinations. We were not alone. The metallic voice over the intercom said, "Harlow Trust Security. Identify yourselves." My hands tightened on the drive. My first thought was that the family had wired the vault. My second thought was that I had been reckless. My third thought was about Layla, about the household staff, about the kids who received books from the foundation and the teachers who relied on grants. The intercom crackled, and then a younger voice said, "Step away from the drawer, Miss Harlow." Quentin's tone had the calm of someone who expected a confession. His men were not in uniform. They were in suits that shimmered unless you looked for the edges. I could hear cameras clicking. I could feel the lights shift. There are moments when the cost of an action becomes unambiguous. Standing with a stack of my father's papers and a hard drive in my hands felt like that. This is where consequences pile. The signature I had placed on the delegation paper that morning would be used against me. The files in this box would give me leverage, but only if I could get them out and make them public. The vault alarms were now the chain that might pin me inside or give them the chance to claim we had tampered with evidence. There was also the knowledge that someone else in the family had access. The box had been opened before us, whether for planting or for search. Dust on the edges showed foot traffic. Quentin's voice softened in that same way people use when they mean to be persuasive, not murderous. "You should come out," he said. "This can be done cleanly. Sign over temporary authority, and we can move forward without scandal." He did not know, or pretended not to know, that I had already signed. He did not know, or pretended not to know, that I had the files that would make their clean theory impossible. I did not answer. For a second, the vault was only my breathing and the hum of a building that once had been Richard's area of refuge. Then a footstep sounded outside the steel door. It was not one man. It was movement that meant they had planned for us to be denied. It was the family closing a hand. There were 3 impossibilities stacked at that moment. First, I had given them an opening to claim I consented. Second, I had documents that could ruin them and destroy decades of names with checks attached. Third, a legal hearing was scheduled in less than a week to contest everything. If anyone could step away now, if anyone could choose to live with principles as a private comfort and let people who depended on them feed their children, then that person was not me. The file in my hand was confirmation of what I had suspected. The signature on the paper that stood in my file at company headquarters was a shield that would buy me time. The sound of a man outside the vault announced that those I loved were in immediate danger. My choice that night set the course. I could be charged with theft if the family said so. I could be lauded as a whistleblower if I survived the legal storm. I could lose everything in the attempt. I opened my mouth to speak and waited for Quentin's next move. He stepped into the doorway and looked at the papers on my lap. He did not look surprised. He looked as if he had finished a calculation that included the worst outcome and had decided he would live with it. "There are cameras," he said. "There are witnesses. You can get arrested here. Or you can step out and we can manage this without anyone getting hurt." I set the drive down on the metal lip of the drawer so it would not fall. The sound it made was small and final. "We can manage this," I said. "Or you can have everything and I will watch it all go." Quentin's face changed in a way I did not have a name for. It was not rage. It was the expression of a man who understood the stakes had gone permanent. Behind him, in the corridor, a shadow moved. I could not tell if it was an extra guard or a TV crew. I could not tell if someone had already been paid to be the public witness. I only knew that when I left the vault that night the world was no longer abstract. It was a ledger of choices and debts. Quentin raised a phone. He said, into it, "Lockdown. Nobody leaves." Layla swore softly. Gerald's jaw clenched. I looked at them both. I thought about the letter in my pocket. I thought about what Richard had seen that none of them did. I thought about the possibility that he had not only protected me, but had set steps that would trap their greed if I followed them. The vault door began to close. The camera clicked. The legal clock ticked in the corner of my head. And somewhere, under the hum of the building, a reporter I did not know took a phone call that would plant a headline in the morning. There was no more room for hesitation. The next move would be decisive. They locked the vault and made it look like protection. Quentin's voice over the intercom sounded practiced. For everyone's safety, the trust is initiating a lockdown. All occupants must remain inside until security clears the situation. His words were neutral. Neutral words are weapons when people want to hide violence behind civility. Layla squeezed my hand once and let go. Gerald's jaw moved like he was chewing a decision. None of us moved. Quentin's men stood in the corridor like statues with radios. Cameras were on. Someone from the press was already filming the glass corridor outside. I could hear distant murmurs and the plastic scrape of tripods. Hand over the drive, Quentin called through the speaker. You can come out. We'll ensure there are no criminal charges if you cooperate. That was the offer. Give up the hard proof that would ruin the family and watch everyone else get quiet. Or keep it and risk being branded a thief, a usurper, the criminal in every headline. Either way, the people I cared about would be the ones to pay. Why should I trust you? I said. My voice did not wobble. I had to know what the floor was before I stepped. There was a pause and then the intercom, because we can keep the foundation active if you hand it over. We can keep people paid. Quentin had dressed his coercion as mercy. It was the same move he used in the boardroom, paint the power play as stability. I kept my hand on the hard drive as if my fingers could turn it metal. Layla said the thing that saved me from panic. If you let them take that, they'll bury it. They will make sure the ledger never sees daylight and the people who stole the money keep the money. She said it like a fact, not a fear. Gerald had the phone on the table. I can upload this, he said. His voice slid low. I brought a sat phone. Old school, but it gets you a route out of the building when the carriers are blacked out. In the pause before he spoke again, a guard clicked a lock echoing down the corridor. The sound made everything else small. Do it, I said. Make a copy and send it to Marin Cade. Send it to Rosa Mendoza. Send it to everyone who will take it and make it permanent. Marin Cade was the attorney Richard used in private disputes. Rosa Mendoza was the investigative reporter who had torn down 2 nonprofit scandals in recent years. They were the kind of people who would not let a file vanish into a safe. They were also the kind of people who would be blamed if the file did not check out. Gerald set his sat phone on the metal lip and hit an app. He plugged the hard drive into a laptop I had not noticed he had. The laptop's screen flickered and then showed a progress bar. Layla watched it like someone watching a heartbeat. I watched Quentin through the small glass window in the vault door and recited the steps Richard had taught me about business sense, absence of grand statements, proof over feelings. He had left me quiet rules, not speeches. Those rules were what kept me steady as the upload began. Outside, the message cycle had begun. Someone with enough inside access to Quentin's schedule posted a clip of him walking into the hall and speaking to the board, framed by sympathetic captions. The caption painted me as unstable, as someone who could not be trusted to handle money. It was precise and cruel. Halfway through the upload, the lights in the vault blinked. Not a power cut, an interruption. The laptop stalled at 23%. Gerald cursed under his breath and restarted the connection. Signal interference, he said. They've jammed the lower bands. That's why the sat uplink is. He paused and then looked at me. They're attempting to isolate us from the world. I thought of small kindnesses Richard had done, of how he had never used his voice to bludgeon. He'd used his time. The family used their mouths. A thought settled with a kind of clarity. Whoever controls the conversation controls the law. Can you break the upload into parts? Layla asked. Send halves to different servers. Gerald did it. He split the files, encrypted them, and sent them out under layered aliases. The first third went to Rosa with a message that read, "Don't publish until you confirm with Marin." The second went to an investigative nonprofit that had a secure drop. The rest he pushed to a secure server in a different jurisdiction and sent hash keys to Marin. It was messy and imperfect. It was not bulletproof. It was a start. Quentin's voice through the speaker shifted to triumph. "We have video of the subject accessing restricted materials," he said. "We will call security. We will preserve evidence. Allow us to conduct an internal review." He had already planned how every move would be framed. He had prepared a narrative that would flatten nuance. Access equals theft. Being in the vault equals guilt. He had embedded a logic in the public's mind that ran on sound bites. Someone outside cheered into a live mic. Comments spilled into my phone. They were sharp and immediate. Then a new line of pressure arrived in a softer voice. Gideon called my number and asked to speak. The man who had stood at the reading and pronounced the words of the will read out his sentences as if they were fact and not a flood. "Amara," he said, "you need to understand that if the family moves to contest the will, there are things they can allege. You must be careful with the evidence like this. If you appear to have taken property, they will take you to court for theft." Gideon was not an enemy. He had been neutral. But neutrality had proved to be the hand that made betrayal possible. "Do you think I've taken anything?" I asked. He did not lie. "I think the optics are dangerous. I think you should let us examine the material." Letting them examine the material felt like handing them the keys to their own purge. I said no. Gideon said the word practical and then hung up. His voice left a hollow. People who speak the language of law can make grayness seem inevitable. I would later find a way to use that grayness as fuel. Inside the vault, the upload reached 77% and then stalled as security's main circuit made a cut. I felt the world shrink to the rectangle on the laptop screen. Layla reached for the emergency crank that sat in the drawer. It would take time to get the generator running. That time was everything. Gerald set the hard drive in my lap. "Take a breath," he said. "If the upload fails, we have this. We have fingerprints. We have dates. We have a physical trail. Will that be enough?" I asked. He shrugged. "Not by itself. But it's a beginning. People who make their careers on lies make missteps." Outside the building, a man I had seen at every family event stepped forward to speak into a camera. His name was Derek Madsen. He described us as a breach of trust and promised a transparent investigation. Derek was Quentin's weapon wrapped in civility. Within an hour, 2 national outlets ran the headline, "Heir accused of theft, company secures trust." On social platforms, the story spread with the velocity of small animals fleeing a storm. People who had never met any of us offered verdicts. My face, which had been in private family albums, went public with unkind captions and doctored frames borrowed from old videos. Someone had edited my laugh into a clip and posted it beside a stock image of luxury, the implication being that I celebrated my father's death. It was a pattern. They had rehearsed how to put me at the center of the narrative and then surround me with noise. I asked Gerald to call Marin and Rosa directly. The satellite uplink hummed once and then gave a crackle. Someone on the outside repeated the words, "We received parts. We can confirm the hashes. We'll hold until we verify bank confirmations." Verification buys time but also gives opponents a target. They would argue the files were planted. They would ask for proof that the source was untampered. The tabloid logic would be simple. How could an outsider produce proof that exposes a dynasty? They would call it a fabrication until the numbers could not be denied. Then a slowdown that felt like personal betrayal. A camera feed showed Layla's face at the house. They had put her photo into a story about insider assistance and implied she had colluded to steal. Tweets called her an enabler. Old comments resurfaced. People who had been polite to Layla for years posted cruel fantasies about her. A line of messages slid into my phone with threats and with requests for interviews from people who wanted her to explain why she helped. I had never thought of Layla as an expendable person. Richard had not either. Layla had been the one to iron his shirts and to memorize his calendar. He had rewarded that utility with trust and steady pay. To watch her vilified felt like being punched in slow motion. They were prepared to smear anyone who helped me. I sent Layla a message. Hold. Don't speak. Let Marin guide statements. She texted back. They put a guy on my porch. They asked if I knew where Amara was. They said they'd make it hard to find work for my daughter. Threats sharpened from public to private in a single evening. A new deception arrived at dusk. A copy of a prior will leaked. It had a signature. The leak claimed it was executed 3 months before Richard's death and left the estate to siblings and to a different charitable structure. The document looked credible at a glance. It was designed to be a blunt instrument. Gideon looped me into the call and said, "If this document is genuine, it changes everything. We have an emergency motion in the morning." The timing was precise. A fake will could undo the legal status of what they had just been forced to accept. It was the move of someone who kept a second file drawer to their life. I asked Gerald if he knew anyone who could verify such a will in the hours before the court opened. He said the only way was forensic handwriting analysis and bank confirmation that was not instant. In the gap, public opinion would do work. "Do they have an expert?" I asked. My throat tightened around each word. "They already hired one," Gerald said. Of course they did. They had hired a handwriting analyst with credentials, a man who would appear on television with a sheet of phrases and deliver the language of doubt. He was part of a chain designed to make the legal fight feel tidy for the cameras. I began to understand how carefully their lies were built. A document, an analyst, a headline, and then a judge who had been fed a story by 9 a.m. At 2:18 a.m., when the last upload completed and the hashes were confirmed, my phone buzzed with a message from Rosa. "We got it," she wrote. "This is bigger than we thought. If it's real, we run tomorrow morning no matter what." The relief in that message was immediate and dangerous. Running tomorrow meant we had to survive tonight. Running tomorrow meant the world would see what we had found. Running tomorrow brought the family to a decision point: stop it at the source or let it go and try to discredit. Quentin chose to try to stop it. At 3:04 a.m., men in suits came into the vault under the pretense of a civil retrieval. They shoved a printed paper at me, a temporary restraining order served in person, an ex parte emergency filing that claimed the documents were being removed illegally and that the trust's property had been taken without authorization. A security man shoved a set of cuffs across the table like an apology. "You're under investigation for theft," he said. Layla's voice broke. Gerald stepped in front of me like a shield. I thought of every kindness I had given the family from the hope that it would be enough. I thought of Richard's handwriting in my pockets, of the envelope that had directed me here, of the brass key that had fit the lock. I had been chosen not because I was weak, but because I did not leave. I had been loyal until loyalty became a weapon. They cuffed Gerald. They slapped a report on Layla that labeled her as accessory. A camera recorded every moment. The world would see a scene edited to our disadvantage. Just as the officers led Gerald out, my phone pinged with a forwarded message, a short clip with Quentin at a podium, perfectly calm, stating that the Harlow estate was securing assets and working with authorities to protect donors. In the caption beneath, someone had added, "Heir arrested after suspected theft. Details tonight." I opened the link Rosa had sent. Half the files were already mirrored on multiple servers. The rest had been sequestered. Marin had sent a single line, "Do not speak. Let individuals call in." Then another message, "We have a problem." A subset of transactions in the ledger align with an offshore account that is not on the paperwork you had. We need to verify. I had thought we were winning by creating distribution. I did not account for the way they would manufacture doubt and weaponize the law to stall. The night finished on a stack of open threats. My allies were being detained for doing the right thing. The family was circulating a document that could easily be framed as the legitimate will. The press cycle was being fed with the words that would make anything I said sound like the act of a desperate woman clinging to a windfall. And in my pocket, the sealed envelope Richard had given me felt like a small, private engine humming with intention. Someone had already decided to make me the center of a prosecution and the scapegoat of a dynasty. They had also begun to dig into the files and to find names that could blow the whole scandal even wider, names with political teeth and a capacity to change who could act or not act. My choices narrowed down to 3 bad roads: fight publicly and watch my friends get crushed in the crossfire, surrender and let the structures that fed children fall apart, or take a personal risk that meant I might never see safety again. I sat on the metal lip of the empty drawer and felt the hard drive in my lap like a promise and a danger at once. The lights hummed. In the corridor outside, voices argued like people bargaining over pieces of a legacy. There were multiple lies in motion. There were multiple people who had chosen their side. The world was fracturing into narratives, and the one I wanted to be true would have to be shouted hard enough to pierce the sound they had built around me. Before dawn, a new message arrived from an unknown number. It contained one line: "They expect you to fold. They don't know what else he left you." The message had no signature. It had no address. But it had a detail only Richard knew. My hand tightened on the drive. The next move would change everything. The lab report landed in my inbox like a verdict. It was 3 lines, clinical and unadorned. Chain of custody compromised. Metadata inconsistent with original timestamps. Unable to certify authenticity. I read it twice, then a third time, as if the repetition could make the words mean anything else. They said the files had been manipulated. They did not say by whom. They only said the files could not be used as evidence without further verification. That one email turned 2 days of motion into a legal trapdoor. Every person who had promised to stand with me found a reason to step back. Marin called first. He did not use his usual calm. He sounded small, and saying that made me feel small with him. "The lab says they can challenge the hashes," he said. "They can argue contamination. The judge will listen to a certified lab that says the chain was broken. We can fight it, but not without proof that our copies were never touched. And without Gerald, our chain looks weak." "Where is Gerald?" I asked. His name came from my mouth like a plea. "They detained him," Marin said. "There was a report this morning. Pending charges. They say he had unauthorized access credentials. They have him on video leaving the facility at an odd hour." The words pooled cold. Gerald had been arrested while we were rushing parts of the archive out into the world. Whoever had arranged the timing had done it with precision. Arresting the man who had uploaded files to journalists cut at the one visible hand we had on the technical trail. Rosa texted next. 3 words that read like a knife: "Subpoena served." She could not run. She could not say more. Her newsroom sent a legal notice and a directive to hold. By noon, the court had issued an emergency injunction. Whoever orchestrated it used an ex parte motion. They argued the files were trust property removed without authorization. The judge signed. The trust was frozen. All transfers were halted. Donors got calls. Grants halted. The kids in the programs Richard had funded the last 5 years would not get their books this month. I could feel the consequences as a weight I had helped pick up and then passed to other people. And then Layla came to me, not with the steady calm that had kept me upright the week before, but with a paper in her hand and a noise in her voice that sounded like someone being cut. "I have to tell you," she said. She did not look at me when she said it. She had signed a statement. She had told them, my family, our lawyers, that she had helped retrieve materials. She had told an investigator she had given Quinton access codes for building maintenance when she thought she was handing keys to a vendor. "Why?" I asked. The question was smaller than the one I wanted to ask. "Why would you do that to me?" She folded her hands and kept them folded like a person holding on to a piece of fragile reasoning. They threatened me, she said. They said if I did not cooperate, they would find a way to make sure my daughter could never work in this town again. They promised a fund for her schooling if I signed. I thought I could protect her. I thought I could keep both safe. There was a numb part of me that cataloged how carefully every thread ran through people's lives. Layla had chosen her child. She had not chosen to betray me as a pleasure. She had chosen survival. That did not make the betrayal feel less sharp. It made it complicated, and the complication did not help the hollow in my chest. I had trusted legal experts on the assumption that the rule of law would bend toward truth. That assumption cracked open mid-morning when a video surfaced. It was short, grainy, pulled from a corridor camera in the trust building. It showed Gideon leaving the vault area with a stack of files under his arm. I watched my lawyer walk with documents the firm had insisted be sealed. The caption that ran beneath the clip on every feed read, "Counsel removes confidential trust material." The clip had no context and gave plenty of impression. I called Gideon. He did not pick up. He called back 15 minutes later to say an investigator representing the family had been at his office and that he had met with them. He said it like a report of the weather. They pressed me, he said. They insisted on reviewing the archive. They asked for anything I had that might clarify chain of custody. I handed over what I had. I can explain it if called. He sounded like someone rehearsing the lines he knew would keep him out of trouble. I heard, beneath the lines, the calculation that told me he had made a choice to keep his seat at their table. He had chosen order over the person who had been named in the will he had read aloud. It was an avalanche of small betrayals that multiplied into ruin. Marin could not verify the upload because the laptop Gerald had used had been taken. Rosa was being sued for defamation by a company named in one ledger entry. Gerald sat in custody with a printed complaint that tied him to unauthorized credentials. Layla bore the humiliation of a signed statement that positioned her as an enabler. Then something else arrived that changed everything in a way I had not seen coming. While I was on hold, a message pinged my phone with an anonymous audio clip. At first I thought it was another smear. I almost deleted it. I listened. 2 voices. One male, the low steady voice I recognized as Quentin's. One higher, practiced, the voice of someone I knew as Gideon. They were not careful. They spoke in the language of people who believed themselves protected. "We need an anchor document," Quentin said in the clip. "If the ledger looks suspect, we bring in the prior will. If we can show a previous testament, the judge will pause everything until provenance is established." Gideon laughed, and the laugh had no humor in it. "We will need the lab," he said. "I can call Dr. Aram. He is old school. He owes me favors. He will find contamination." "And Gerald?" Quentin asked. "I handled Gerald," Gideon said. "We have a story about credentials. We have a video that places him acting at an odd hour. We detain him publicly. The optics will be clean." The clip ended. My hands were trembling, not with the fear of being charged, but with the recognition that a man I had trusted, the man who had read my name out so plainly the week before, had plotted the erasure of my credibility with my own family. That conversation reoriented the room. It explained the arrest. It explained the chain of custody claims. It explained how a forged motion had made its way so quickly in front of a judge. It also proved intent. Once I knew they had planned to manufacture the narrative, the world turned from a place of competing accounts to an arena where I was being stamped as the inconvenient factor that needed to be neutralized. I thought about the ledger in my lap, the hard drive that had contained the copies Gerald had sent. The files were not yet repudiated everywhere. Rosa had enough of the hashes. Marin had copies he kept secure. But the judge's injunction had been clear. Everything tied to the trust was frozen, including the copies. The media could not publish while the court held it. The only thing the clip had done was open a new front: criminal allegations. Layla's face went drained and old. They told me they would make it impossible for my daughter to get into school here, she said again. Amara, they offered me security. Security. It was the currency that made people betray. Security bought the cooperation of lawyers. Security bought silence. Security made a woman I had loved as kin sign a paper that would be used to hurt me. I did not hate her. I felt small and furious and used. When the family released their version of events, they framed it as a rescue. They said their actions had prevented a breach that would have harmed donors. They called it stewardship. They called Gerald a rogue actor. They called me a stranger who had broken in. The words were precise. The coverage played the outline of guilt without filling in truth. At midday, Marin sent me a file he had managed to pull before his office was visited. It was a list of transactions that matched names I recognized from galas. It was not only domestic transfers. It showed cash flows to addresses that matched a shell company name Quinton's wife had once mentioned in passing at an event. The ledger confirmed what I had suspected. The numbers were there. The evidence was there. And yet the lab's note had shifted everything. Proof needed to be admissible. Admissibility required chain of custody. Chain of custody required Gerald. Gerald was detained. Gerald's credibility could be broken in a single courtroom exchange if the prosecution wanted it broken. The family had built their strategy with that in mind. By late afternoon, I had no counsel I trusted. Marin's hands were tied by notices and threats. Rose's newsroom had been issued a subpoena that could bankrupt them if they published. Gerald's lawyer sent a single text via Layla. He's being held for 48 hours. They are pushing for charges. They say he bypassed security protocols. He says he did not. I read and then erased the text for fear I would not be able to stop shaking. That was the midpoint, the place the story split from contest to catastrophe. The people I had believed would stand beside me were either compromised or under threat. My best allies were legally muzzled. The family had used the law as a blade and a shield. They had turned procedure into power. There was one place left to look, one last small box of paper and numbers I had not opened because I had hoped not to find something that would make me angrier than I already was. In box 419 there had been a thin envelope labeled personal. I had assumed it was a note of thanks or a small instruction. I had not expected a recording. I played it in the kitchen because the quiet there felt less formal than the rooms used for hearings. The voice on the tape was Richard's, and it was immediate in the way a person speaks when they are not rehearsing for a room. If they turn on you, he said, do not come with a lawyer first. Go to Marin, go to the island file. Tell him the phrase I taught you. The ledger is a map. Use it to find the safes no one will look for. If the world sees only our mistakes, then show them the pattern. You must not be alone. There was a pause and then a lighter voice, his, the one he used to be private with. I chose you because you kept your small promises, he said. They kept their red lines. The recording ended with his last sentence clipped. It did not explain every step. It offered an instruction and the knowledge that he had seen the fight coming. It told me where to look, but not how to beat a courtroom that had already been prepped to bind me. I had been stripped of allies and left with a riddle. Someone had recorded his voice and left me a map. The map required a route through people who were now either compromised or behind bars. The ledger proved theft and also promised exposure. The judge had frozen the trust. The press had been gagged. The family had moved their pieces into place. I went to bed that night with the sense that everything had been reindexed against me. I had evidence and no way for it to be heard. I had a recording that spoke of safes and islands and phrases, and nothing that could be used in a court until someone with the authority to authenticate it stood up. My allies were arrested, harassed, or silenced. My home had become a place where threats lived right under the polite veneer my cousins used in interviews. And the worst part was not that they had taken my options. The worst part was that the man who had stood up for me with a single sentence in a room had also left me these small impossible tasks to do alone. The midpoint left me not only betrayed, but isolated in a way that felt both cruel and inevitable. It stripped away comfort and replaced it with a list. It asked me to become the person I had not yet learned how to be, not the grateful daughter who showed mercy, but a woman who could turn a ledger into a weapon even at the cost of making enemies of everyone she had loved. I had two choices left that night. I could accept the injunction, let the charity die, and hope the world would forgive me in time. Or I could follow Richard's map into the dark places he had prepared and hope the truth there would be enough to break the chain they had welded around me. When I replayed his voice, the line that stayed with me was simple and sharp. If they turn on you, do not come with a lawyer first. I understood then that this fight was no longer about proving betrayal in a court that could be bribed or bullied. It was about finding the one thing that would make a judge stop and a newsroom run, and it would require that I step into parts of his life the family thought he had buried. I had the ledger. I had the recording. I had a map with names on it. I had a list of people who had already chosen side and the reasons why. The rest would require breaking all the rules I had been taught to live by. They took everything that weakened stages, precise and polite. First came the notice from the bank. Account frozen pending litigation. The forms landed in my inbox like verdicts, signed by lawyers with names I had seen at dinners. Then the sheriff's deputy arrived with a civil order. The trust had petitioned for protective custody of the house until the will contest resolved. That phrase was chosen to sound careful. It meant someone else would be living in the rooms where I had learned to tie a tie and where Richard kept the typewriter. They did it bureaucratically. They handed me paper and a list of points, each one smooth with legal language that made removal sound like assistance. I was given an hour to collect personal items. They suggested storage arrangements. Derek Madsen stood in a corner and delivered a statement to a press cluster assembled outside. The family was ensuring continuity and safety. Cameras fed back my expression and turned it into a caption about instability. Inside, Ivy walked through the house like a woman moving into a role that had always been hers to perform. She told me, with a smile practiced enough it had no warmth, that this was what Richard would have wanted: order, stewardship, care. She did not stay to pack. People who plan takeovers never stay to feel the consequences. Layla came to the front door with an envelope in her hand and a face I did not recognize. She had been my study. She had been the person who met the delivery vans and whose daughter used the scholarship funds. She took my hands and told me quietly they offered her placement, Amara. They said if I signed the affidavit they wanted, they would guarantee a seat at the school for Alina. She spoke like someone informing me of a decision already made. There was no room for argument once the threat had teeth. Her voice trembled around the name of her child. "What did you sign?" I asked. She held up the paper. It said she had voluntarily turned over maintenance codes and conceded access she had authorized in the past. It read like a mistake and like a confession at once. She had written that she'd cooperated to ensure community safety and donor protection. She had done what they asked so they would stop threatening her daughter. I did not yell. There was no language left to yell with. I felt anger and a grief I had not had room for. I thought of every small favor I had done in the house, every unpaid hour I had volunteered, and the way kindness had always been the only proof I expected people needed. It was not proof. What I had mistaken for belonging was leverage for everyone else. They moved people out in neat clumps. Staff who had been promised salaries for months were given severance notices or temporary suspension letters. The foundation's payments were called under review and then frozen. Children on scholarship learned by afternoon that their programs were paused. A teacher texted me one word, empty, and then deleted the message. It felt like a physical ache to know a room once filled with books would sit still because adults would not stop fighting. Quentin held a press conference where he looked tired in a measured way. He translated their actions into care. He called the injunction a necessary pause and used phrases about protecting donors that made their theft sound like responsibility. The public would hear a version of truth polished until it had no edges. Banks cut off access to cards associated with the trust. My personal accounts, ones Richard had opened for me, were unreachable. A clerk at the bank read the order into a phone and said they were following instructions. There was no evil villain, there were procedures. The procedures were how they took the house without blood. I tried calling Marin, and he answered with a new tone, apologetic and practical. I'm trying to keep things from getting worse, he said. There are motions I can file, but until Gerald has counsel and until we can verify the chain of custody, the judge is cautious. Where is Gerald? I asked. In custody, Marin said. They're treating him like he intentionally breached protocols. We can petition for his release, but the prosecution has leverage. I am working on it. He was not strong. He sounded like a man who had been forced to choose between legal theory and a friend. He could not promise much. Rose's newsroom sent a single message through an intermediary, subpoena, legal hold. They were ordered by a judge to delay any release. She wrote a note that said, I hate this. We're trying to find a way, but they can hold us accountable for libel. That word, libel, had weight in it that could bankrupt acts of courage. They used legality as a wall. It was a stricter wall than anything I could have imagined. Rules can be a merciless thing when turned into tools. At noon, Layla called. She had a new voice flat. They came to Alina's school, she said. They said they'd withdraw the offer. They showed me letters they said donors would immediately pull funding if I did not sign. They said they'd make sure she couldn't work here ever if I resisted. I asked her if she could get help, if she had told anyone else, if there was a lawyer who could contest the threats. She said there was nothing left for her to do. The choice had already been made by people who had more power than she did. She told me she had done what she thought was right for her child. I did not blame her. There is a thing small people do when cornered. They trade someone else for the safety of their own. They had taken the house. They had taken the foundation's accounts. They were taking people's careers. And then they came for me. It started with a knock at the door of the small room in the guest house where I had kept the things that had once been mine. It was a civil officer with a quiet voice and a list. He said, Ma'am, we have orders to remove any occupants who are not authorized by the trust's temporary administrator. I gathered what I could. The brass key. The sealed envelope. My father's old cufflinks. A sweater that still smelled faintly of his aftershave. The deputy watched me with the trained softness of a professional. He expected me to be a certain way, tearful, compliant, grateful for the mercy of a polite removal. I felt none of those things. I felt like someone stripped of permissions. They drove me to a small rental on the other side of town and left me with a floor plan and a phone that buzzed with messages that asked me to confirm a statement. The house I had known was now refitted with press releases and corporate portraits and Ivy's tasteful arrangement of Richard's books into the new narrative. The first night in the rental, I opened the sealed envelope. There was a second recording and a note in Richard's handwriting. He had been precise on the tape. If they ever force you out, he said, there is a second ledger. It laps over the pattern we found. Go to the island file. Speak to Matteo at the marina. Don't bring counsel. I had a name, Matteo, and a place, the marina by the island, and a warning, do not bring a lawyer. The recorder's urgency stuck in my throat. He had not offered comfort so much as a route. It felt like a map that required walking. The next day they published a piece that had been phrased and placed by someone who wanted me to be small. It included a quote from someone listed as a family insider who said the retrieval of materials from the vault raised legal concerns and that the family was forced to act. People who had once smiled at me posted reactions. I watched a video loop of my face and felt like I had been turned into a problem. I had less than nothing. The trust's freeze meant grant checks stopped. Teachers called to say they did not know how to tell parents. The local food bank we had supported one small way wrote me a note. Donations are delayed. We do not know for how long. I felt responsible for things I did not control. Then they offered me a deal. A man in a suit I had only seen in the background of events walked into the rental with a stack of papers and a patient expression. He had the same voice as the lawyer who had read the will that day. "Gideon, sign this," he said, handing over a document that would relinquish any challenge to the current management for 90 days. "In exchange, we can make concessions for your people. We can get Gerald out on limited bail. We can guarantee Alina's school placement if Layla withdraws her affidavit." It was perfunctory. It was precise. It smelled like a bargain made by people who believed they already owned everything. My hand shook. There was a moral arithmetic here I could not solve. We could exchange justice for lives. We could buy Gerald out and save Alina, and in doing so, we would erase the traces that could bring long-term accountability. Or we could refuse, keep the ledger and the copies circulating, and watch more people lose work, more children lose scholarships, more names vanish into the freeze. "Why would I trust you?" I asked. He looked at me, and for a second I thought I saw where. "Because if you don't, they will use you as an example," he said. "They will burn the charity's good works to the ground by tying them to scandal. They will walk away. You think I like any of this?" I read that will too. I know what it meant to him. Gideon had been neutral long enough to become complicit. Neutrality bored then into something else. I wondered if he had always known where his loyalties would land. I left the form and signed. A day later, I woke to a message from Layla. I signed. "I'm so sorry." They threatened to remove her school offer. They had emails ready. "I cannot risk my child." Her words were shorter than before. She had chosen her daughter. I went to the foundation's kitchen to see the shelves. They had been cleared. The volunteers were out. Some told me in whispers that donors had pulled support immediately. The rooms that had been full of lists and filings now had only dust where paperwork had been. I felt hollow in my chest because the children who had not done anything were paying for this fight by losing what they needed. When I went back to the rental, my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. My instinct was to hide until things were less painful. I answered. On the line, Gideon said, "I didn't come here to offer a deal. I'm here because I can't be part of what they've done anymore." He sounded smaller than he had looked in the courtroom. "There's a safe deposit box in Geneva with the original ledger and a set of signed papers no one can credibly contest. The family thinks they burned every copy. They didn't. I can get it, but I need you to do something first." His voice tightened. "I will not take a fee. I will take a risk. If we move that box, the chain is messy. It will look like you orchestrated it. It will raise questions. But with that box, authenticated original signatures, unaltered document prints, we can make the judge listen." I wanted to say yes. I wanted to believe the answer would be simple, a box and then justice. Instead, I heard what he needed next. "You will have to let me represent you publicly. You'll have to make me your counsel. You'll have to be willing to stand with me in front of cameras and risk the smear, because the family will tie me to them even if I flip." He had been one of them. He was asking to be allowed to be one of me. The choice he presented was simple in shape and devastating in consequence. Trust the man who had been part of the machinery and let him stand with me, make him a target and risk whatever that meant. Or refuse him and keep moving alone, with less chance the courthouse would consider the originals. I sat on the small couch and held the brass key in my fist until the metal warmed under my skin. The sealed envelope that had been my father's last private decision sat on the table like a small, folded faith. I thought of Layla's trembling hands. I thought of the children who had been told there would be books and then had none. Gideon waited for an answer that would determine what we did next. Behind his request lay a cost that could not be traded later. He wanted to be my public advocate. For him to be my ally meant he would have to burn where he had once sheltered. I had run out of easy answers. I had also run out of safe places to stand. I told him nothing. I hung up. The phone went silent and the room felt smaller. Outside, in the streetlight, a car pulled up and a man took a photo of the house where I had lived. On the back of the photo, someone had scrawled a note and left it under my door. "You chose to fight. We will make it worse." I held the note and the brass key and the sealed envelope, and I felt the dark place where choices live. There were 3 impossible ways forward, each with inescapable costs. Sign and sell the truth to save people and live under a history edited by others. Refuse and watch the community suffer while hoping the law or the press eventually cut through. Or take a risk with a man who had been part of the system and hope his change of heart was real. The night closed in with the sound of cars. I stared at the key until my hands cramped. When the knock came at the door, it was not the deputy nor a camera crew. It was Gideon, standing there without his suit, face smaller than the courtroom had made it. He put a single file on my lap and said, "There is one more ledger entry they didn't expect. If you're willing to risk everything, meet me at the marina at dawn. Bring nothing but the key." He looked at me like a man asking for pardon and daring me to grant it. His last sentence left the room like a rope. If we fail, they will erase every one of us. If we succeed, we can take the house back. I held the file as if its paper might cut me. The choice was a cliff. I had nothing left to fall back on but a key, a recording, and the small stubbornness that had kept me at the table for years. Don felt impossibly close and impossibly far. He did not ask for proof that I was the daughter he remembered. He only said, "He trusted you," and the sentence landed with more force than anything Quentin had shouted in court. Mateo spoke without ornament. He had been the one who met Richard at the docks for years. He had not been invited to families or parties. He had been given tasks and kept confidences. He put his hand on the brass key I had shoved into my pocket the night they moved me out. He did not treat it like a curiosity. He treated it like ownership. "You have to understand," he said, "he never kept things he could lose. He kept things he could hide when people looked where they expected to look." That was the first thing that made me breathe differently. We did not spend time convincing each other. He offered a plan and a fact. The plan was simple: the island. The fact was that Richard had maintained a private boathouse with a lined compartment he used for documents he did not want near lawyers and accountants. "You go with me," Mateo said. "No counsel. No cameras." He told me you would be the one to come. Richard's instruction had been a line on a tape and a note I had replayed so often its edges had become familiar. "Do not come with a lawyer first." The instruction had been practical and pointed. It had also been an insistence that I act in ways the family would not expect. Now Mateo repeated it with a regard that made the choice less about principle and more about survival. There was danger in following it. There was also a chance to be the first person to hold originals the family could not easily discount. Gideon arrived and did not step onto the boat. He stood on the dock with a jacket in his hand and his throat tight in a way I had not seen since we had first met at the reading. He had a list of contingencies and a phone in his palm. He had offered earlier to be my public counsel and to stand with me in court. Now he said, "I will not come with you. He told you not to bring counsel. I will wait and coordinate." His presence was a choice. It was a compromise. I knew his history. I knew he had been the neutral man who had read the will that day and then had worked with the family. Trusting him had costs. Not trusting him could cost me the chance to authenticate anything I found. For the first time, the decision did not feel like kindness or belonging. It felt like strategy. We left the dock without a scene or a crowd. Mateo made no speeches. He pushed off and motored across the channel. I held the brass key in my hand because carrying it in a pocket felt like offense. Saying his name aloud did not make the trip lighter. The island was not what the press had described, and I will not spend time describing it. What matters is the sequence. Mateo took me to a boathouse, we went inside, and the lock accepted the key. There was a drawer, and inside the drawer was a box with an old bank stamp and a fragile label. The label read personal. There was no flourish. There was no threat. There was only the thing Richard had promised, records he had kept where they would be less visible to men in suits. It was smaller than I had imagined. I opened the box with hands that trembled because trembling is not dramatic, it is only a fact. Inside were ledgers with original signatures and bank stamps. There were checks, photocopied with the back of the deposit slips still attached, cancelled by a bank in a small jurisdiction where the family had once kept corporate accounts. There were handwritten notes in Richard's cramped script that referenced conversations and dates and names I recognized. There was a ledger entry marked with a shorthand that matched one I had seen in the files box 419 had held. It was proof that did not depend on an upload or an analyst. It was paper that bore the weight of a signature and the stamp of a bank clerk. The discovery did two things at once. It made me feel less alone, and it made me know how dangerous the next step would be. "Do you have everything?" Gideon said through the radio Matteo handed him. He had practiced saying nothing, and yet his silence said everything. Matteo and I worked quickly. I cataloged the items with his guidance, noting dates, matching stamps, and photographs of the originals. I followed a checklist he suggested, and then he said something I had not expected. "He left you a letter if they turned on you," he said. "It is here." I found an envelope labeled for Amara in Richard's handwriting. Inside was a short letter and a recording key for a device I did not own. The letter was brief and not theatrical. He wrote he had not been able to stop everything. He wrote that some men would not be satisfied with money and that his name had been used as an argument for silence. He also wrote instructions about a notary in Geneva and a name I had not yet known. Matteo had one of the men who worked the island who had a contact at a private bank. The letter said to split the originals. One copy to a neutral bank, one to an independent journalist, and one to keep. He had planned more than I knew. The device contained a recording. His voice was steady and private. "If you can make them listen," he said, "use the things that cannot be claimed as copied. Bank stamps, cancelled checks, and hand-signed letters." He listed names. He spoke plainly of transfers he had not authorized and of accounts he had followed with a ledger. He named a man I had trusted as being on the list of payees. He did not choose rhetoric. He chose facts. I felt a change in my chest that was not relief. It was activation. The man who had always been patient had built a map, and now that I had the map I could choose to follow it. Gideon called and said they had a narrow window at noon the next day to file an emergency motion in a jurisdiction that respected physical evidence. He had contacts who would authenticate the bank stamps. But there was a cost. The motion would require that the originals be produced and that they be brought through channels that would be visible. The family could then claim tampering and call it theft. The court would examine chain of custody, and a judge prone to caution could still rule for the freeze. "You can hand the originals to me, and I will move them to a notary in Geneva," Gideon said. "I will be your counsel publicly. I will sign an affidavit that I received them directly from you. I will stand with you." Matteo looked at me and said, "If you give them to a man who has stood with the family, you make him public and you risk him turning. If you keep them, you become the one who looks guilty." I had no appetite for making a new liar my shield. I had also run out of options that protected the people I loved. Layla's daughter still needed a placement. Gerald sat in custody. Rosa had been subpoenaed. The judge had frozen the trust. The families that relied on grants were in the middle of a calendar that did not care about fairness. The choice that moment offered was not moral in tidy terms. It was an alignment of consequences. I could take the originals to Gideon, make him my public counsel, and accept that he would be tagged as the one who moved them, or keep them hidden, try to authenticate through other channels, and risk being charged with theft when the family made the next play. Both roads had danger. Both roads had possible redemption. I said, "I will not hand them over without a guarantee." Gideon answered, "Guarantees are not a court of law. They are a man's word. But I can swear on my professional standing that I will file the materials with an independent notary, and I will put the originals in escrow under a third party. I will also go on record and give an interview. If they try to say I engineered this, they will have to explain why their own counsel is producing documents that show their accounts." His willingness to expose himself mattered. He had a life he could lose. It made his offer more than a tactic. I had to decide if this man would be my partner or my exposure. There was no way to know if he would remain loyal under pressure. There was no way to know if the family would find a way to break him. I had to choose on the basis of what I had: Richard's letter that asked me to split the originals, Matteo's steady presence, and Gideon's offer to stand in public with me. I made a choice that surprised me. I did not sign a paper that night. I did not hand the stack to Gideon while I stood under his eye. Instead, I placed half of the originals in a waterproof sleeve Matteo had, and we slid those into a safe deposit we could access through a contact Matteo trusted on the island. I handed Gideon a photographed index and an affidavit I wrote and signed in his presence stating where the originals were and that I had delivered copies for authentication. I asked him to file an emergency motion and to reveal his willingness to be public counsel. He hesitated for the length of a breath, and then he pocketed the affidavit and said, "I'll file at first light." "You are making me a target." "I know," I said. We agreed to a split strategy. Some originals would go into the chain we could authenticate through neutral banks. Some would be held in places where they could not be immediately seized. We would attempt to control the story by giving proof to people who would not be owned by my family. We left the island with a weight that was not just paper. It was a plan and a public position. The cost was clear. Gideon would be asked at noon to stake his career on me. Matteo would be exposed as a confidant. I would be the face of movement and the target for every smear they could manufacture. On the way back, we heard a voice on the radio that made my scalp tighten. "Port Authority," the voice said. "This is a request to make a routine sweep of the island for hazards. Who is with you at the dock?" It was official and it was neutral. It was also a way to make sure we were noticed. Gideon looked at me and said, "They are moving faster than I expected." I felt the full shape of the choice I had made. I had moved from being the woman who let kindness be enough to being someone willing to risk her name and the safety of others to expose a ledger. That risk was the transformation that would either save what Richard had tried to protect or break everything and everyone he loved. We had 3 things in our pockets: the brass key, half the originals stored in a place not easily reached, and the affidavit Gideon would file at dawn. There were also the unresolved dangers: Gerald still in custody, Layla under threat, Rosa tied by subpoenas, and a family that had already shown they would use the law as a blade. The impossible choice I had made was not between right and wrong. It was between damage measured by time and damage measured by certainty. I had chosen certainty. I had chosen to put my name where evidence could be verified and hope that a judge would listen to originals stamped by banks rather than to the slick narratives my cousins would spin. We pulled into the dock and I stepped onto the planks and felt the air on my face and a phone vibration jolted in my pocket. It was a message from an unknown number with a single sentence: "We know where you are." Someone attached a photo of the boathouse. Gideon answered his phone and a voice I did not know said, "You have 5 hours to stop." There was no name. There was no request. The impossible choice had been made. The next moment would decide whether it had been courage or a rush toward self-destruction. Quentin took the podium as if the room belonged to him. He had the practiced cadence of a man who had spent his life arranging facts until they felt kind. He began with stewardship and stability and a line about protecting donors that had been polished until it fit into every headline. They did not expect me to stand. I had promised myself I would not make a scene. I had promised Richard, in the quiet ways he used when he was at his most deliberate, to act with proof and with patience. I had also promised myself that I would not let fear be the measure of how I lived. I stepped forward and placed a single folder on the council table. It was small. It was heavy. Gideon stood beside me. For the first time since he read the will aloud, his posture was not neutral. He had chosen a side. That choice would cost him everything he had built. He knew that. I knew that. He also knew how to speak in a courtroom and how to make a judge listen. The judge looked at the folder and then at me. He asked for a brief statement. Quentin smiled and gestured as if I were the interruption. He did not know what I held. He had planned for noise. He had not planned for evidence that would not be displaced by sound. "This folder contains originals," Gideon said. "Bank-stamped checks, deposit slips, and a ledger with original handwriting and stamps from a financial institution with an independent notary in Geneva. We will also produce witnesses who can verify the chain of custody for those originals." They laughed at the word chain of custody. It sounded theatrical coming from a family that had made procedure into a weapon. Quentin's smile tightened. He signaled someone to pass a note. The first witness we called was Matteo. He walked to the stand and said his name and his job. He described places and times with a precision that made the room listen. He said he had been at the island boathouse at a set of dates, and that he had seen Richard place documents in a drawer he used for things he wanted out of lawyer's sight. He had watched the drawer once and then again, he said, because he was a man who kept small promises. He then confirmed that he had handed originals to me that morning and that those items matched the copies we were producing. Next came a man in a blue tie who did not look like the men who had smiled at gala dinners. He was a bank official appearing by video call. His face was steady and official. He held up a stamp and a scan page and said the bank kept records of cancellations and a server log that could not be changed without detection. Gideon had spent weeks making this call. The bank official read an account number and then a list of transfers that matched the ledger we had brought. "Transfers to shell entities," he said. "Transfers labeled as charitable disbursement and deposited into accounts held under nominee names. The sums correspond to disbursements on dates tied to board decisions." There was a pause long enough for someone in the room to make a calculation in private. Quentin's mouth opened, closed. Ivy's face thinned. The judge asked for more. He asked for verification that what we presented were originals. Gideon slid a packet across the table. It was a notarial acknowledgement from an independent Geneva notary and a signed affidavit from a clerk at the bank attesting to the stamps and server logs. We were no longer arguing about uploads and metadata. We were holding the paper one could not alter without leaving a long trail. Quentin's counsel rose and argued that the documents were acquired unlawfully and that the chain of custody was broken the moment the vault was opened. He said the family had sought judicial notice to preserve the trust. He used legal words the judge respected. That was their strategy. Make language into a shield. Gideon answered with a list of dates and movements, and with the affidavit from Matteo and the bank. He produced a second witness, a forensics technician who had examined the paper and the ink and found no evidence of alteration on the originals that had been shown to the notary. The court reporter kept her eyes on the transcript and the room began to lose its smugness. Then Gideon did something Quentin had not accounted for. He played a recording. It was the clip I had by then heard enough to know the edges of its cruelty. The sound came clearly through the room speaker. I watched Quentin's face go a color that was neither shock nor anger, but a slow recognition that the world had turned to a different language. The voices on the recording spoke plainly. One was Quentin's. The other was his counsel. They talked about an anchor document, about Dr. Aram, about manufacturing provenance. They named a timeline. They spoke of Gerald and of an X-part motion and of clean optics. It was the conversation I had heard before, but this time it had context. The bank official had matched payments that corresponded to the names used in the recording. The numbers were there. Quentin's lawyer objected. The judge asked for the source. Gideon answered that the recording had been authenticated by a third party in a neutral jurisdiction and that the bank log traced payments to a company associated with the analyst named in the file. The room had the sound of air sucked in. This was not argument any longer. This was cause. Someone started whispering. The press shifted cameras. A reporter reached for a line and found her microphone already on. We did not stop there. Gideon asked for the ledger. He asked the bank official to compare the signatures on the canceled checks with signature cards the bank kept and with deposit endorsements. He asked the bank official to say, on record, that the transfers had been routed through a narrow network of accounts, including an account registered to a company whose beneficiary details listed a name that matched a trust controlled by Quinton's household. The bank official did. There was no dramatic confession from a single person on the stand. There was a stack of small facts laid down until the structure they had built could not hold. The judge did what judges do when a pattern emerges. He ordered an immediate freeze on accounts listed in the ledger, and he referred the matter to a criminal investigator. He said there would be a preliminary inquiry and that he would reconsider the injunction in light of the materials produced. The room reacted the way rooms react. Voices overlapped. The microphones picked it up. A camera's red light turned solid. Quinton stepped down from the podium pale and then composed. He tried to speak. His voice had the practiced steadiness of a man whose life had been designed to survive noise. He said the family had acted to preserve donors and that no wrongdoing had been proven. He called for due process. He called for time. I had expected this. I had not expected that a moment of proof could feel so small. When the judge granted the motion to refer and to temporarily unfreeze the accounts tied to acute charity payments, there was relief. But it was a legal relief, not a personal one. The ledger had been validated enough for a judge to act. The rest would take time. Then I did something I had meant to do since I first found the envelope in Richard's handwriting. I played the recording he had left me. His voice sounded as it had when he chose words for the people he loved, low, direct, without ornament. He did not make a speech. He explained. He spoke the names of people he trusted and the reasons he trusted them. He said, plain and without ceremony, that he had left things to me because I had been steady. He said that money without truth is theft, and that legacy is not the sound of a name, but the measure of what it has meant to the people who received it. The room moved as if someone had pulled a thread. Faces that had been carved into shapes of power fell into an expression I had not seen, recognition of what they had lost and of the fact they had helped dig their own graves. Outside the courthouse, the world changed faster than any of us expected. Headlines published the bank official's affidavit. Donors called to retract promises. A handful of board members posted statements of immediate resignation, and a few sought anonymity in the legal fog. A public relations firm scrambled to spin. A senator's aide called a reporter and asked what the implications were. The ledger contained names with influence. The call that came to me just after noon was not a threat. It was a request for comment from an investigator with jurisdiction to issue subpoenas. The tone of that call was purposeful. The family tried to recover. Ivy made a statement about care and continuity and about grief. Quinton folded his shoulders and said statements about family and process. The words were smaller now that a judge had asked for an investigation. They felt defensive. There was cheering among a group of volunteers who had been working at the foundation. They gathered in the corridor and read the judge's order, and then they read the ledger. They had once told me my loyalty had been helpful. Now they looked at me with a new sort of calculation. Some reached out to say that they had suspected something and had not known how to say it. Some had preferred silence because fear had seemed cheaper. The public humiliation happened in stages. Editors published the bank's affidavit and the judge's referral. Anchor desks replayed the recording of Quinton's plotted conversation and attached expert commentary. There were retirements announced and an interim committee named. Quinton's allies issued thin defenses. A trustee I had watered plants for once issued a statement saying he had been misled. It was small, and it sounded small when the ledger had the numbers. I felt vindicated and hollow at once. The recording from Richard that had saved the ledger's credibility also forced me to face what winning would cost. The cost had already been measured in other people's lives. Layla had lost her position temporarily, and her daughter's placement had been the bargaining chip that had pushed her to sign. Gerald had sat in a cell for reasons that would now be examined and, possibly, dismissed. Rose's newsroom remained under subpoena and had not yet published in full. The judge's referral did not repair those harms instantly. It only turned public wheels, which are slow and likely to grind slow enough that people get hurt along the way. The climax was not a single moment of triumph, but a series of small clarifications that together made the family's version of events impossible to sustain. The judge's order did what we hoped a judge would do. He pulled at the ropes that made secrecy possible and exposed the knots. The final blow was private and sharp. When I walked out, a reporter handed me a note. In a single line it said that there was a statement from a foreign notary who had just confirmed that a will recently produced by the family bore signs of manipulation. The note did not say more, only that a sworn affidavit would be filed that afternoon. For the first time since the reading of the will, the prior document the family had waived as proof of rightful inheritance had a plausible rebuttal. There was still a horizon of risk. The criminal investigation might not prosecute. Judges might rule in ways that kept assets entangled for months and years. My family could still hire counsel and press charges of theft against me. They could appeal any order. They could, and likely would, try to break the public story by finding new accusations, by suing newspapers, by raising enough noise that the truth would get dizzy in public conversation. As we left the hall, Gideon said, in a voice that had the tiredness of a man who had chosen to burn, "This is not over." "But you made them step into the light." Matteo held my coat and said nothing. He had been a quiet man all through this. His silence had been its own kind of support. On the way out, my phone buzzed with a single message from an unknown number. It read, "You won a battle. But there is one name in that ledger that will call in favors, and that has the power to shift courts. Be careful." I folded the note into my palm and felt the paper between my fingers. I had achieved a public verification I had been told could not be achieved. I had forced a judge and a bank to say there was enough to investigate. I had made a family with the resources to bury truth see the light. I had not, however, ended the fight. The room had shifted. The truth had been told in a form that could not be simply erased. The judge's referral meant investigators would knock on doors and issue subpoenas, and that the public would watch. The family had been wounded publicly. They were not finished. We had earned a moment of vindication and the right to ask more questions. That was the point where justice often began to look less like an ending and more like the start of a long process. I had the ledger, the recording, and a judge willing to look. The rest would be time, and I had learned at every cost that time was a thing you had to use. They led Quentin out in handcuffs the morning the indictment came down. I watched from the gallery because I could not leave the moment to someone else. His face was steady for a second, and then it folded. That image stayed with me through the weeks that followed. The investigation moved faster than I expected. The prosecutor presented a pattern: falsified disbursements, nominee accounts, obfuscated transfers that routed donor funds into private pockets. The recording of the conversation Quentin had in the vault room, the bank stamps from Geneva, the canceled checks with signatures that matched the originals from the island box, all of it fit together like evidence in a court that had finally chosen to look. Indictments followed for fraud, money laundering, and obstruction. Quentin resigned from the board that afternoon. Ivy stepped down as a trustee. Derek Madsen issued a statement and then faded from the public feeds. A handful of trustees tried to distance themselves by calling it mismanagement and asking for time. Time was no longer a tool they could use. Investigators froze additional accounts and issued subpoenas to shell entities named in the ledger. The press no longer had to guess. They had documents the courtroom had accepted as real. There were hearings and arraignments and a legal machine that moved with slow, effective pressure. Quentin negotiated a plea on some counts and refused others. Ultimately, a jury found him guilty on multiple charges. The sentence did not erase the harm, but the conviction created consequences for the people who had treated authority as permission to take. Ivy accepted a plea for falsified reporting, performed community service, and was ordered to make restitution. Some family members who had been involved in cover-ups settled civil claims and gave back funds to the trust under judicial oversight. The most important change happened to the foundation. The judge ordered an immediate unfreeze of the accounts tied to active programs and set a strict plan for oversight. That plan put money back into classrooms and teacher salaries and into the small food bank that had been left on a pause. Donors who were not implicated in wrongdoing returned or renewed funding after independent audits confirmed the ledger. We restored payments first to the charities that would suffer irreparable harm without immediate assistance. The children who had lost programs received the books we had promised. Seeing that happen felt less like victory and more like returning something stolen. Gerald was released after prosecutors acknowledged his role in preserving copies and after independent digital forensics confirmed the uploads Marin and Rosa had received. The criminal complaints against him were dropped. He returned to work and declined offers of big contracts, choosing instead to consult on internal compliance reforms for the trust. Rosa's piece ran in full once the subpoenas cleared. Her newsroom received threats and legal pressure, but their reporting stood up to scrutiny and won awards. Marin and Gideon both took hits to their reputations for different reasons. Marin had pushed hard to protect the integrity of the evidence. Gideon, who had stepped out from his old neutrality to stand with me publicly, faced inquiries about past choices in the firm he had served. He weathered professional consequences, but did not abandon me. His testimony helped investigators understand the internal moves that had been disguised as procedure. I did not take back the company out of spite. I took it back as a responsibility. The board that had been in place when Richard died was dismantled. I appointed independent directors and a governance committee with experts in nonprofit oversight and corporate ethics. We hired an outside audit firm to review 5 years of accounts and to publish the results. We rewrote grant agreements and held open meetings for donors and beneficiaries. I named an interim CEO for the business division whose job was to stabilize operations without family interference and to report directly to the oversight committee. I kept the foundation under my stewardship and built a structure that would keep power from concentrating in private hands again. There were private reconciliations and public refusals. Layla returned to the office with a guarded smile and a staff position that came with guarantees and a clause ensuring her daughter's placement at the school. She had been forced to make a terrible choice under threat. We rebuilt what had been broken for her. Gerald sat across from me the afternoon he was cleared and said nothing for a long time. We both knew what had been at stake and how much had been lost to make a truth visible. Rosa called once with a quiet laugh that sounded like relief and exhaustion. Mateo kept bringing coffee to the meetings and said nothing dramatic. He remained the person who knew how to keep small promises. Some family members asked to meet. A few showed remorse and offered apologies that contained action, public statements of restitution, and cooperation with investigators. Others vanished from the record. I did not accept all apologies. Forgiveness in my house did not hinge on words alone. It hinged on repair, on accountability, and on the work done to restore what had been taken. I did not make the choice to break the family. I made the choice to protect the people who were never supposed to be collateral. There were victories that were practical and victories that stayed private. We rehired staff whose pay had been cut. We returned funding for community programs. The Foundation's emergency grants reached teachers and after-school programs in weeks rather than months. We created a transparency portal where donors and beneficiaries could see fund flows and audit results. We instituted a whistleblower hotline with guaranteed independence. The house we had lived in was returned to the trust under court supervision, while a process was established to decide permanent ownership. I did not rush to take everything for myself. I took only what served the public purpose my father had professed. For me, holding his name was now about accountability, not entitlement. I found, in the months after the indictments, a steadiness I had not expected to claim. The woman they had mocked for being help was the one who had kept a ledger in a box and who had not walked away when it would have been easier to be small. That did not mean I had become someone else overnight. It meant I had learned how to measure loyalty and to choose where to put it. I had learned how to build systems that could not be bought or hidden. There were costs. Some friendships never healed. The house was full of repaired furniture and new policies, and a sense that history could not be erased. Public exposure had consequences for people who had not wanted them and for people who had done wrong. Justice had arrived in forms that were bureaucratic and incomplete. A few of the men whose names had been in the ledger still had influence and had not been prosecuted. One name in particular, a donor with political sway, remained a threat. Investigators were pursuing that threat, but I had learned to expect time and to prepare for it. On a quiet Tuesday, months after the judge's referral, I went back to Richard's study. I sat at the desk where he had taught me to use the old typewriter and turned the brass key over in my hand. It fit better in my palm now. I had the house in trust, the foundation functioning, programs delivering, and a board that could neither be easily bought nor easily frightened. I felt exhausted and satisfied and clear. There is no perfect ending to what was done. People were punished and others were spared. I did not get to repair every wrong or to fix every life touched by their greed. But the ledger had been exposed, the trust had been restructured, and the children had their books. That was a kind of justice worth holding. If this story kept you with me, tell me where you are watching from and what the weather is. If you want more, leave a like and subscribe. Share the episode with someone who needs to hear what accountability can look like. Ask questions in the comments, I will read them. There is one loose thread that will keep me awake. One name in the ledger has the power to move courts and to redraw balances. Investigators are working it, and I will be part of that work. If they try to rewrite the story again, I will be ready. For now I am building something that makes it harder to steal, yes, and also makes repair the rule. Thank you for staying with this all the way through. If you want another story of a private inheritance that splintered into public reckoning, say so in the comments. For the next piece, I will tell you what it took to turn this painful victory into policy, how to change a system so the next family cannot do what mine almost did.